A magnificent bull was left wounded by barbed wire, but the vet who came to help wasn't ready for what happened next. What happens next will leave you speechless. The air was heavy with the scent of trampled grass and fresh blood. Bramble lay on his side, his massive chest rising and falling in slow, strained heaves, the deep red smear along his flanks stark against his brown hide. Dr. Elias Marrow was already moving before his truck's engine had fully gone quiet, the slam of the door echoing across the open pasture. His boots sank into the soft earth as he crossed to the north fence, where Owen Stannard stood stiff-backed beside his foreman, Jonah Pike. Neither man spoke, but their eyes betrayed the unease they tried to hide. Jonah's gaze darting to the distant tree line, Owen's fixed somewhere beyond the bull, as if refusing to meet the reality of the moment head-on. Elias dropped to one knee beside Bramble, the late afternoon sun catching on the glint of wet blood and tangled fur. His trained hands moved without hesitation, pressing gently along the wound's edge, feeling the way the flesh resisted. Bramble snorted and shifted, a low, pained bellow rumbling in his throat. Elias murmured something low and steady, his voice more for the animal's benefit than the men watching. But as he peeled back a clump of matted fur, his fingers hit something that should not have been there, cold, jagged, and foreign. He reached for his small field kit, snapping on a pair of gloves. Owen finally spoke, his voice clipped. "Can you get it out?" Elias didn't look up. "We'll see." His focus was absolute now, the rest of the world narrowing to the few inches of injured flesh beneath his hands. With slow, deliberate pressure, he eased the embedded object free. A shard of metal, rusted at the edges, but with a shape too deliberate to be a random break from a fence. Its jagged tip was beveled, almost sharpened. He held it up to the light, letting it catch the sun. Jonah's jaw tightened. "That doesn't look like no fence wire I've seen." His voice was low, but there was a current beneath it. Anger or fear, Elias couldn't tell. "It's not," Elias said simply, wiping the shard clean on a cloth before slipping it into a sample bag. He had learned long ago not to make assumptions in front of clients, but inside, his mind was already building possibilities, none of them good. A gust of wind swept through the field, rattling the loose strands of the nearby fence. Elias noticed then the line of deep, human-sized footprints leading away from where Bramble lay. They trailed off toward the far edge of the pasture, where the tall grass swayed in uneven waves, hiding whatever, or whoever, might be there. "You see those tracks?" he asked, glancing up at Owen. Owen gave the briefest nod but didn't answer. Jonah, however, shifted uneasily. "Been seeing prints like that for days now, always near the stock pens. Thought maybe it was just drifters." His tone made it clear he no longer believed that. Elias kept his voice neutral, but his eyes were sharp. "And you didn't think to mention this sooner?" "Didn't seem relevant until now," Jonah muttered, though he avoided Owen's gaze as he said it. Bramble shifted again, his breath coming in shorter bursts. Elias turned back to the wound, applying disinfectant that hissed against the torn flesh. "I'm going to have to sedate him if I'm going to stitch this properly," he said, pulling a vial and syringe from his kit. The bull's ears twitched at the metallic click of the needle, but Elias worked fast, sliding it into a vein with practiced ease. As the sedative took hold, Bramble's muscles slackened, and the tension in the air seemed to ease slightly. But that relief was short-lived. From somewhere beyond the pasture, faint and distant, came a sound. 3 short whistles, sharp and deliberate. Bramble's ear twitched toward it even in his half-dreaming state. Jonah's eyes snapped to the tree line again. "Hear that?" Elias straightened slowly, scanning the horizon. "Could be nothing," he said, though the tightness in his voice betrayed the lie. He'd heard plenty of whistles used in livestock work, but this was different, measured, purposeful, like a signal. Owen shifted his weight, his boots grinding into the dirt. "Jonah, keep watch," he said, his tone heavy with something unsaid. The foreman nodded, moving toward the fence line with long, purposeful strides, lantern in hand, despite the sun still hanging low in the sky. Elias stitched in silence, the only sounds the soft pull of thread through flesh and the distant rustle of grass. His thoughts turned over the shard of metal in his kit. Fence wire frayed, bent, or twisted, but it didn't sharpen itself, and it certainly didn't lodge this deep in an animal's side unless someone put it there. Jonah returned after several minutes, his face pale and his breathing uneven. He leaned toward Owen and whispered something too quiet for Elias to catch. Owen gave a single, curt nod, his jaw set. Elias tied the final stitch, trimmed the thread, and began wrapping the wound in a thick layer of gauze and bandages. As he worked, he decided to press again. "If there's something I should know, now's the time to tell me. This wound, it's not from an accident." Neither man answered immediately. Finally, Owen said, "Just do what you can for Bramble. We'll handle the rest." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. When the bull was stable and resting in a makeshift pen near the barn, Elias packed up his gear but didn't leave. Something about the quiet around the ranch felt wrong. Too still, too watchful. The light was fading fast, the sky bleeding into deep orange and purple. He saw Jonah slip a shotgun under his cot in the corner of the barn before lying down. It was the kind of action a man took when he expected trouble, not when he hoped to avoid it. Elias stepped outside for a moment, letting the evening air clear his head. The wind carried the faintest echo of those whistles again, now almost lost in the rustle of grass. His eyes swept the darkening horizon, catching a flicker of movement far beyond the fence, too far to identify, but enough to make his pulse tick up a notch. When he went back inside, Owen was leaning against a post, arms folded, gaze fixed on Bramble. "You'll stay the night," Owen said, not as a request, but as a statement. Elias studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Fine, but if there's a danger to your stock, or your men, I'd rather know now than find out when it's too late." Owen didn't respond. The only sound was Bramble's slow, steady breathing, the rise and fall of his massive chest under the lamplight. Jonah sat sharpening a knife in slow, methodical strokes, each scrape of steel on stone loud in the otherwise quiet barn. Outside, the wind picked up again, and Elias could almost swear he heard movement in the tall grass beyond the fence. He thought of the shard of metal in his kit, its deliberate edges, its unnatural place in an animal's body. And he knew, without yet knowing how, that this wasn't over. Jonah's jaw tightened, and Owen avoided his gaze entirely. The needle slid into Bramble's thick hide with a practiced precision, and Elias pressed the plunger slowly, watching the sedative take hold. The bull's massive frame shuddered, then eased as the muscles began to slacken. Elias worked fast, cutting away clotted fur to expose the wound. His eyes locked on the torn flesh, tracing its shape, its depth, the unnatural way it had split. This wasn't the random tearing of wire. It was too clean on one edge, too jagged on the other, as if someone had known exactly where to strike for maximum pain without killing. The shard came free with a wet pull, its rusted edges catching the lamplight. Elias turned it over in his gloved hand, the metallic smell sharp in his nose. "This wasn't an accident," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. Owen, standing behind him with arms folded, gave no answer. His gaze stayed locked on the distant slope beyond the pasture, the fading light casting his face in hard lines. Jonah shifted beside him, hands buried in the pockets of his worn coat. "That's the third time this month," he muttered, the words slipping out like something he'd been holding back. Elias paused, the thread of his needle hovering over the wound. "Third time what?" "Someone, something, targeting our stock." Jonah's tone was matter-of-fact, but the way he glanced at Owen told Elias this wasn't something they spoke of openly. Elias looked between them, the pieces beginning to align in his mind. "And you think this wasn't random?" Owen finally spoke, his voice low, almost reluctant. "It's no coincidence Bramble's the one hurt this time." "Why Bramble?" Elias asked, though the answer came before either man could speak. He remembered overhearing at the feed store a few weeks back about the upcoming Grenton Regional Livestock Show, the kind of event that drew breeders, buyers, and gamblers from miles around. Jonah filled in the rest. "He's the centerpiece. If we win, Owen's ranch gets top breeding contracts for years. If we don't, well, there's men who'd like to see us fall." Elias's stitches tightened as his thoughts raced. "So we're talking about sabotage, to force you out of the running." Neither man confirmed it aloud, but their silence said enough. By the time Elias had finished cleaning and dressing the wound, the light outside had dimmed into the deep blue of evening. Bramble was moved to a pen inside the barn, its heavy wooden gate barred from the outside. The smell of hay and oil hung in the air, mingled with the earthy scent of the bull's sweat. They were about to settle for the night when the first sound came, low, deliberate, and carrying far in the still air. 3 short whistles, spaced evenly. Bramble's ears twitched. Even sedated, the bull's head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring. Jonah's head snapped toward the open barn door. "You hear that?" Elias nodded, the sound crawling down his spine. It wasn't the aimless whistle of a herder or farmhand at work. It was too controlled, too intentional. Jonah grabbed a lantern from its hook, the flame flaring against the sudden rush of cold air as he stepped outside. His boots crunched over the gravel path, each step measured, cautious. Elias stood near the doorway, eyes fixed on the moving glow of Jonah's lantern as it cut across the yard and toward the pasture's edge. The wind carried faint rustles of dry grass, the groan of the barn settling, and somewhere beyond that, nothing. Minutes passed before Jonah reappeared. The lantern swung low in his grip, his other hand clenched tight at his side. His face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line. He crossed to Owen and leaned close, speaking in a whisper that Elias couldn't catch. Whatever was said made Owen's shoulders tense. "Lock the doors," Owen said aloud, his voice like gravel. Jonah set the lantern down and slid the heavy crossbar into place, sealing the barn from the inside. Elias had worked on ranches his entire life, through storms, births, and even wild predator threats, but never had he seen a barn locked from within. The gesture wasn't about keeping something in, it was about keeping something out. Elias stepped forward. "Mind telling me what you saw out there?" Jonah shook his head once, his mouth tight. "Best not." The answer only deepened Elias's unease. He moved toward his kit, pretending to reorganize supplies, but his eyes tracked Jonah as the foreman crossed the barn to his cot in the corner. Without a word, Jonah reached beneath it, pulling out a shotgun. The metal caught the lamplight, cold and unforgiving. He laid it within arm's reach before sitting down heavily, his hands never straying far from it. Elias's mind kept circling back to the whistle, the wound, the shard of metal. Whoever was behind this wasn't finished, not if they were bold enough to linger within earshot after dark. The lamplight flickered as a draft swept through the barn. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the faintest echo of movement in the tall grass. Elias forced himself to keep his hands steady as he packed away his instruments, but his thoughts were anything but calm. Something bigger was happening here, something calculated. And as he watched Jonah slide a hand over the shotgun's stock before lying back, Elias felt the quiet settle around them like a warning. That night, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the injury was part of something much bigger, and the unease deepened when he saw Jonah quietly sliding a shotgun under his cot before turning in. The pen door hung slightly open, the latch dangling loose against the wooden frame. Elias's stomach dropped. Bramble was gone. The straw inside was disturbed, hoof marks scuffed deep into the packed dirt as if the bull had been let out rather than broken free. He crouched, running his fingers over the latch. No splintering, no bent hardware. It had been opened cleanly, by a hand that knew how to do it without leaving damage. "What happened?" Owen's voice was sharp, cutting across the early morning stillness as he strode toward the pen. His boots hit the ground hard, the tension in each step mirroring the tightness in his jaw. Elias stood. No sign of a break-in. Whoever did this wanted it to look like Bramble wandered out on his own. Panic surged in Owen's tone. "Jonah, search the pastures." The foreman didn't waste a second. Grabbing his hat and coat, Jonah moved toward the pasture's edge at a near run, eyes scanning for movement. Elias followed a different instinct, moving toward the muddy patch beyond the barn. The rain from 2 nights ago had left the ground soft, and now it bore a trail of fresh prints, Bramble's heavy hooves interspersed with boot marks. "Someone walked him out," Elias muttered under his breath. The trail stretched toward the far end of the property, toward the old irrigation canal. He knew the place, its cracked concrete sides, the shallow trickle of water, the overgrown reeds that made it an easy place to hide. It had been all but abandoned for years. Owen caught up to him. "You sure?" "Positive," Elias said, pointing to the overlapping prints. "They didn't just drive him, they took time to guide him this way." The 3 men followed the trail in tense silence. As they neared the canal, the reeds parted enough to reveal Bramble. The bull stood knee-deep in the slow-moving water, his head hanging low, a deep groan rumbling from his chest. The bandages Elias had applied were wet, clinging to his flank. Elias stepped into the water, the cold seeping into his boots. As he got closer, something caught his eye, a metallic glint beneath Bramble's belly. Dropping to one knee, he reached under and found a small metal cylinder strapped tight with a narrow leather belt. The device hummed faintly, its casing warm to the touch. "What is that?" Owen asked, his voice taut. Elias worked the buckle loose. "Crude tracking and stimulant rig," he said grimly. "Keeps an animal agitated, forces its heart rate up. You leave it on long enough, you run them to exhaustion, or worse." Jonah's face hardened. So this wasn't just about hurting him. Someone wanted him found, but broken. Elias turned the device over in his hands, his mind turning over the implications. This wasn't random cruelty, it was calculated. Someone had the skill and equipment to pull it off, and they were close enough to slip onto the property, take the bull, and plant this without being seen. The crack of a rifle split the air. The dirt at Elias's feet erupted in a sharp spray, the bullet's impact sending a jolt through him. Jonah reacted first, barreling into Elias and knocking him sideways into the cold water. "Down!" Jonah barked, dragging him toward the shadow of the canal wall. Another shot followed, this one hitting closer to Bramble, sending the bull thrashing in panic. The angle told Elias everything. Whoever was shooting was up on the ridge, high enough to see but far enough not to be easily reached. "They're not aiming to kill!" Elias shouted over the noise, his breath ragged. "They want us scared off!" "Not leaving him!" Owen growled from the other side of the canal, his eyes blazing as he waded toward Bramble's side. Elias thought fast. The open ground between them and the barn would leave them exposed. "There's a bend in the canal just ahead. It'll block their line of sight. Jonah, get to the truck and meet us there. Owen, we'll move Bramble along the water." Jonah didn't waste time arguing. He splashed out of the canal, keeping low as he sprinted toward the distant yard, his figure disappearing behind a line of hay bales. Elias took Bramble's halter, murmuring to keep the animal calm. Every step was slow and labored, the bull's limp worsening as the cold water worked against his injured muscles. Owen stayed on the other side, his hand steady on Bramble's flank, ready to push him forward when the bull hesitated. Another shot rang out, this one hitting the water just behind them. The ripples spread outward, the sound echoing against the canal walls. Elias's heart pounded, each movement forward feeling like a mile. Finally, they reached the bend. The earth rose sharply on one side, cutting off the shooter's view. The sound of boots on gravel reached them before Jonah's voice did. "Truck's here. Let's move." They coaxed Bramble up the sloped bank, the bull groaning with each push. Jonah threw open the trailer gate, and together they guided the bull inside, the thud of his hooves on the wooden floor a small relief in the chaos. Elias climbed in behind him, making sure the halter was secure and that Bramble wouldn't collapse in the tight space. Outside, Jonah slammed the gate, and Owen leapt into the passenger seat. The truck roared to life, gravel spitting from the tires as they sped back toward the barn. Only when the heavy doors shut behind them did Elias allow himself to breathe fully. He set the metal device on a workbench, its faint hum still vibrating through the wood. He didn't need to say what they were all thinking. This wasn't over. As Owen checked on Bramble and Jonah stood guard by the door, Elias leaned against the bench, his mind racing. The method, the timing, the brazen daylight attack, it all pointed to more than sabotage for a competition. By the time they made it back to the barn, Elias had pieced together enough fragments to suspect that the attack wasn't just about the show prize, it was about forcing Owen to sell the ranch. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of compassion, unexpected animal intelligence, and the profound bonds that can form between humans and animals in moments of crisis. This narrative aims to highlight the importance of empathy, inspire a deeper respect for all creatures, and remind us that a simple act of kindness can lead to an extraordinary connection.